In many ways, Edoardo Paolozzi was not only an outstanding artist, but still is a crucial figure to understand the post-war era. To begin with, he was the child of migrants. His maternal grandfather had moved from Italy to Edinburgh around the turn of the 20th century to open a confectionery shop. This is Edoardo's grandfather, Pietro Rossi, with his daughter Carmela, mother of Edoardo, and his son Carlo, in front of the family shop in Edinburgh around 1920. His daughter Carmela married a man from the Italian village her father once had left, a confectioner as well, who opened his own shop in Edinburgh, and in 1924, Edoardo Luigi was born in the Scottish capital where he would not feel at home. Quote, "The Italians in Britain were considered strange and inferior, but when you got to Italy, you were a prince." So he went. And between 1933 and 1940, spent 8 of his holidays in a summer camp organized by the Italian fascist movement. Here, of all places, he had his first encounter with modern art, seeing the catalogue of the exhibition of the fascist revolution from 1932 that had been staged by futurist artists. This is Carmela Paolozzi and her son Edoardo. In the fascist summer camp, however, young Edward was proud to wear the black shirt. That may have provided him with a strong identity for a while. He even wore it at home in Edinburgh, as you can see in this photograph from 1934, together with his mother and his black shirt. In Edinburgh, young Edoardo may have been the object of many a resentment towards the migrant's son, who was considerably overweight and therefore would not succeed in the boys' culture of sports and physical competition. And eventually, he even became the exponent of an enemy state, namely when Italy declared war to Britain in 1940. Aged 16, Edoardo suddenly belonged to a family of enemy aliens, mistrusted for being possible spies. Given the close connections the family had held to fascist Italy before, the suspicion seemed justified, and so Edoardo's father, whom you see here in front of his own shop, and his maternal grandfather were deported by the British authorities and shipped to an internment camp in Canada. The ship was dumped by a German submarine with no survivors. Meanwhile, the family shop in Edinburgh had been destroyed, like many other stores of Italian immigrants, in the first wave of violence after Italy had declared war to Britain. The shop had not only offered confectionaries, ice cream and sweets, but tobacco and cigarettes as well. Paolozzi later remembered that, I quote, "The carefully arranged shop windows usually had been dressed by a visiting confectionery representative with Sunday dishes holding ice creams fixed in perpetuity in some composition material, and chocolates made of composition materials in glass bowls filled with crepe paper. In the shop itself, still Paolozzi speaking, on glass shelves backed by mirrors were glass jars containing the real thing. In very little time, this world, which had existed for a decade and a half, was reduced to splintered wood and small pieces of broken glass," end of quote. Growing up in a family shop as a child, Edoardo may have been spoiled by enviable privileges as far as ice cream and sweets were concerned, which of course is not relevant in our context. Relevant is that he also had direct access to the universe of package design, advertisement, and the gifts that were produced in context with the luxury goods of those days. Collectibles like cigarette cards, for instance. At the beginning of the 20th century, the marketing of luxury goods was accompanied by collectible pictures, just as these from Will's cigarettes, that mostly had no narrative relation to the use value of the commodities, but enhanced it with images and stories. And it is easy to imagine young Edoardo channeling off some of that stuff for his private entertainment or in order to impress his schoolmates. Having direct access to luxury goods, their illustrated design, and to accompanying pictures may have opened a world to him not threatened by social or political exclusion or cultural differences or wartime discrimination. The typography and clichés of commercial advertisement that would be called pop culture only 2 decades later. Being interested in drawing and collecting pictures, in 1941 the 17-year-old Eduardo opted for a visual profession and applied, now Briticized as Edward, at the Edinburgh College of Art for evening courses, wanting to become a commercial artist. He was accepted as a gifted drawer, obviously already interested in sculpture. His art education was interrupted for more than a year by his military service in a British aliens company of the Royal Pioneer Corps. But already in 1944, he could complete his studies full-time at the Slade School of Fine Art. Not too enthusiastic about the official teachings at the Slade, in 1946, Paolozzi was modeling sculptures in concrete, this one is in plaster, that was shown at the Mayer Gallery and earned him the then considerable sum of £75. So, waiving his diploma, Paolozzi left London, aged 23, in 1947 to live in Paris, not planning ever to come back to Britain. He was heading for the world's capital of modern art. Paris still and again was in the second post-war age. Obviously, Fernand Léger, Georges Braque, Constantine Brancouche, and Hans Arp opened their studios to him, as did Peggy Guggenheim, whose private collection he could see. He met Balthus, Tristan Tzara, Jean Hélion, Jean Dubuffet, and was admitted to the collection Mary Reynolds held with works of Marcel Duchamp. But most of all, Paolozzi was fascinated by Alberto Giacometti, in whose studio he obviously spent hours or even days. In these days, Paris was humming with the post-war pathos of re-establishing modern art after it had been raided by the Nazis everywhere they had invaded. But Paolozzi's reaction to the resurrection of the pre-war avant-gardes was split. Officially, he was interested in primitivism, still fashionable and still uncriticized at the time, drawing African masks and sculptures at the Musée de l'Homme. And most of all, of course, he was impressed, as his whole generation was, by Pablo Picasso. This is a head from 1947 made in Paris, collage, gouache, and ink on paper. And the influence of Giacometti can be seen in sculptures made of bronze, like this table sculpture from 1949. Some of the sculptures were shown in his second one-man exhibition at the Mayer Gallery in 1948 and earned him some new money to spend another year in Paris. While Picasso and Giacometti influenced drawings and sculptures were his official body of work, on the side there was a more or less secret body of work to become prominent only decades later. Between 1947 and 1949, Paolozzi produced many collages that he did not exhibit for decades. They are the subject of my talk. Already in London, Paolozzi had had an official body of work and a rather private one on the side. At the Slade School of Art, he had met the expectations of his teachers during the day by drawing the nude academically appropriate, while in private he already paid attention to the modern transformation of the nude, the pin-up. The main sources of his early collages in London had been discarded books, the scraps of war. Therefore, most of the illustrations had been black and white. They mainly dealt, as Robin Spencer has summarized, I quote, with images of ancient sculpture and mechanical parts torn from war-damaged books, end of quote. This one is from the scrapbook People in China, 1943. This is Athena, Heracles, and Atlas, a collage from the scrapbook Election from 1945, still made in London, as well as this one, Nike des Paionos, taken from a German book, obviously, collage on paper from 1946. Confronting fragments of antiquity with elements of modern machines, Paolozzi measured out the difference between the still valid classicist standards of academic art education in Britain and the impact of modernism already recognizable as the machine age. Already in London, Paolozzi had kept these collages to himself and obviously never exposed them in his early exhibitions, nor to his teachers, who would not have liked them anyway. It is essential to know that Paolozzi produced these collages in a tradition very different from that of Dadaism, which of course he was familiar with, but in a much more older context, the tradition of the scrapbook, in German, das Klebealbum. This is a double page from scrapbook number 1, around 1947, obviously made in Paris. The name scrapbook, which should not be misunderstood as Skizzenbuch, which is Klebealbum. The name scrapbook stands for a common family and childhood entertainment in the 19th and early 20th century. It was part of a popular culture dealing with the new media of newspapers, broadsheets, magazines, and illustrated books. Corresponding to the growing offer of cheap and ubiquitous illustrations by graphic prints, mostly engravings or lithographies, the habit of collecting them, cutting them out, and rearranging them was as popular as it was completely harmless, and that means by no means Dadaistic. This is scrapbook number 1 as well, a double page. If the early collages of Paolozzi may appear similar in form to Dadaistic collages, their aesthetical status was completely different. Exactly this point is missed when pages from Paolozzi's scrapbooks are selected and isolated from this context in reproductions for art books and presented as if they had been made as solitary vertical form artworks to be framed for the wide cube exhibition wall. In fact, most of them were not. The scrapbooks obviously served as a kind of visual diary Paolozzi kept throughout his 30s. So there is a perceptual trap only because many books on Paolozzi present pages of his scrapbooks unhinged from their original context. We regard them as solitary works of art. But to understand the secret part of Paolozzi's early London and Paris years, what seems to be collages have to be recontextualized in the framework of scrapbooks and to be reproduced as double pages, as they had been produced. When Paolozzi arrived in Paris, the inventory and temperament of his scrapbooks changed dramatically, as you can see here, double page from scrapbook number 2, around 1947. The private format of his collecting and pasting stayed the same, but the content of the scrapbooks changed from the black and white collages he had made in London, confronting academic classicism with the machine age, to now colorful arrangements of advertisement and consumer goods. Double page from the same scrapbook. Machines did not only appear with their monumentalized mechanical interiors, but as perfectly designed consumer goods, like cars and vacuum cleaners, or as nice and handy electric kitchen utensils used by delighted women and smiling couples. This is obviously a collage. It's a psychological fact, pleasure helps your disposition, from 1948. Color entered lavishly into Paolozzi's scrapbooks, and it was a very specific color. It is the print color of magazine illustrations and advertisements, rare and precious in the black and white post-war era in Europe. In its most striking examples, it is more dense and aggressive than any avant-garde of painters may have thought of before. Even Picabia might have been embarrassed. Paolozzi received the magazines full of advertisements, obviously from ex-GIs who had chosen to stay in Paris, and from other expatriate sources in Paris. Thus, the colorful pictures he cut out and pasted in his scrapbooks told of a distant paradise of consumer goods and canned food people in post-war Europe literally were hungry for, and so, of course, was Paolozzi. The English-speaking Scotch-Italian discovered America in Paris, of all places. In a milieu of American ex-GIs, he probably felt as familiar by language as he did with the French painters and sculptors by art. Now his scrapbooks became visual diaries of an important change in European culture, the Second American Invasion, channeled through the media. In one of his inspiring essays, Boris Groys has identified the artist as an exemplary consumer, and this was especially true for Paolozzi in his Paris years. It does not minimize his merits if we regard his scrapbooks as a visual magazine reader's digest. Instead of being the commercial artist he once planned to become, he now collected commercial art instead. And in his scrapbooks, he arranged a multi-layered diagnosis of his very epoch, the second invasion of Europe, this time by US consumer culture, in the wake of the first, the military invasion that had begun with D-Day, that we Germans should still be grateful for. But in fact, it was a war that had supplied Paolozzi with his materials, floating them over the transatlantic into his bohemian studio in Paris through the post-war channels of local GI culture and American expatriates. The relation of pop and war is rarely discussed, but it's manifest since the 1940s. And of course, World War II had not only touched Europe. Thus, Paolozzi was an exemplary consumer on a global scale. It was the Second World War that had helped American standards of life to expand all over the globe, wherever GIs were present. The stations of this post-war Americanization were their barracks between Iceland and North Africa, between Great Britain and Japan, between Sicily and the Philippines, in Australia, and on many a Pacific island, exactly that part of the world which consecutively was labeled the free world. If we had a world map of this very special moment when American pop culture was globalized in the wake of the Second World War, we would see US Army barracks spread over the world as crystallization seeds of a global pop culture. The Army radio disseminating big band jazz, Frank Sinatra pop, and during the night sessions maybe early rhythm and blues by Louis Jordan or Big Joe Turner. The improvised barrack cinemas presenting Alfred Hitchcock suspense, Douglas Sirk melodramas, and Marlene Dietrich. Magazines like Life or Time offering the full glamour of the US cultural life in color and in professional poses. Nobel Prize-winning literature by Sinclair Lewis or Eugene O'Neill, and not to forget Pulp Fiction by the likes of Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. The Army shops displayed tinned food in colorful cans and cigarettes in brimful packages that outside the barracks served as currency. And leaving the casernes off guard, the GIs displayed their casual wear, blue jeans and button-downs, or later Hawaii shirts, that made everybody else look very provincial. With nylon stockings in their pockets as a special currency for the lovers they attracted, especially if they went by those large limousines, which, totally different from the army jeeps, looked as if they could fly if they only would try. Thus, also in private, the soldiers were messengers of an intact consumer paradise far away but approved by their apparition. The worldwide presence of American army barracks, missile bases, or military airports, of course, did not influence every culture. In some cases, because it conflicted with language barriers, as in France or in Italy. The Roman cultures proved resistant against the American seduction for a couple of decades, with the forced exception of Cuba, of course, and especially France fostered its famous cultural exception l'exception culturelle. In other countries where English was spoken, religious tradition prevented the cultural dominance of American pop culture, like in India, for instance. But generally, it was the global diffusion of English as a first or second language that favored the global success of American pop culture. And so an important precondition for the globalization of American pop culture in the 20th century can be detected in British imperialism of the 18th and 19th century, having spread the Commonwealth language that made Australia as receptive to US pop as Canada, and of course, the Britons themselves. When English was established as a second language in secondary schools all over large parts of the world, much to the regret of the French, a growing global homogeneity in language opened a worldwide market for the export of cultural goods, like films, music, magazines, and literature. And so Pax Americana, if there ever was one, was a Pax Pop too. And it still was in the 1960s and 1970s, when the war in Vietnam was probably the first with people killed to a pop music soundtrack, as Francis Ford Coppola has pointed out in his film Apocalypse Now. The very matrix of all this was, of course, not only the military infrastructure and the omnipresence of the English language, but the media. Printed media, audiovisual media, and electronic media were and still are the matrix of pop culture and made it universal. Pop is the phantom of the media. And this was especially true for countries who had already opened their markets for American export before World War II, and this was the case during the Third Reich. In 1981, the German historian Hans-Dieter Schäfer was the first to examine the close relation that Coca-Cola, Ford, and Hollywood had kept to fascist Germany until the USA entered the war in December 1941 and even later. Hollywood was present in the Third Reich till 1940, and Coca-Cola was produced in license in fascist Germany till 1942. In his groundbreaking book, Das gespaltene Bewusstsein, Split Consciousness, Schäfer focused on the ongoing relations between American industry and media with Nazi Germany that has become a topic only recently in the American academia as well, in books by Ben Urwand, The Collaboration, Hollywood's Pact with Hitler, or Thomas Doherty's Hollywood and Hitler, 1933 till 1939, both from last year. And among the media that proliferated American pop culture throughout the world, finally, of course, art has to be mentioned. Painting and sculpture. In the beginning 1960s, the impact of pop art as an art market style marked the recognition of pop culture among artists, collectors, and intellectuals in London, New York, and Los Angeles. And that was the moment when Eduardo Paolozzi finally could make use of the part of his oeuvre that up to then he had kept more or less to himself, even after he had returned to London in 1949. Why had Paolozzi been so shy to show this post-war part of his oeuvre before the late 1960s? He once had tried a kind of coming out when in front of the young group within London's Institute of Contemporary Art, he had presented his scrapbooks, collages, and their source materials with an epidiascope. The reaction of the young group, shortly after to be renamed Independent Group, in April 1952, was mixed. One of the opinion leaders of the group, Rainer Benham, obviously made fun of Paolozzi's obsession with his popular and corny material, with his kitsch, leaving Paolozzi not encouraged to pursue this track of his studio work in public. Paolozzi might have felt caught with his middle-class, immigrant, and uneducated childhood obsessions by a member of the British elite who had studied at the Coteau as Benham had. So for one exception, the ICA exhibition Collage and Objects in 1954, Paolozzi obviously did not show his scrapbooks and collages anymore, but focused on traditional materials as bronze for distinctive surrealistic sculptures. And so he installed himself as a successful sculptor, participating in Documenta 2 in 1959, aged 35, and in 3 Documentas to follow, which means he was extremely successful and respected as a kind of post-surrealistic sculptor. But there seemed to be more reasons for Paolozzi's long-term reluctance to show his scrapbooks and early collages. There is some very greedy situation about this collage of food and drinks. There's something very greedy about this collage of food and drinks: canned pork and sliced ham, grilled meat and green peas, chocolate and cigarettes. Probably no one can understand who did not suffer the post-war shortage of all of it. It might appear as if Paolozzi had suffered from the pudency of an omnivore, when he in fact was the chronicler of the cupidity of the post-war austerity. But there's also a nearly sexual confusion of cars and girls, machines and bodies, mock men and Mickey Mice, women and consumer goods, that may have appeared as embarrassing private obsessions then, but have become cultural standards since, pop cultural standards, that is. In hiding his the secret part of his work for 2 decades, Paolozzi clearly missed the chance of having been recognized as the father of pop art, not only in Britain. In 1971, when the Tate Gallery dedicated a retrospective to Paolozzi, slide projections of scrapbooks and collages were shown in permanence, and screen prints of his early collages followed. One of the best experts in British pop art, John Paul Stonnett, has pointed out recently that the belated screen prints of the early collages were made to foster Paolozzi's primogeniture in the making of British pop art, after the Tate Gallery had presented Hamilton as the father of British pop art only 1 year before. Making screen prints of the early scrapbooks and collages was a way to keep the scrapbooks intact and still make use of their best pages by translating them into prints. And only lately have books on Paolozzi begun to differentiate between the scrapbook collages from the late 1940s and their posterior screen print versions, like we see it here as a couple of collage and print. The scrapbooks themselves remained in Paolozzi's studio as a more or less secret core of his oeuvre, always within reach. And it may well be that his Cologne exhibition in 1979 was the first at all to present the complete selections of his scrapbooks in vitrines. On this occasion, the Cologne exhibition of 1979, one of those scrapbooks was reproduced in more or less black and white, the Psychological Atlas, which Paolozzi obviously had begun in Paris. This is the reprint, the cover of the reprint of the Psychological Atlas, which of course was in color. The material basis, and that's the reason why I show it here, the material basis of this Psychological Atlas is a catalogue that had been published in this very Haus der Kunst, at the time labeled Central Collection Point. It was the cover of a black and white reprint. This is the cover of a black and white reprint made on the occasion. This thin catalogue, which of course was in color, as can be seen here, accompanied an exhibition of modern and contemporary art called Kunstschaffen in Deutschland. Paolozzi must have gotten hold of this brochure in Paris, and he plastered the catalogue brochure entries, which seem not to have met his fancy, with images from magazines like a run-through for a surrealistic drama. The title, Psychological Atlas, encourages a more detailed psychological interpretation of the scrapbooks. I unfortunately do not have the time to practice. And so I come to my last image and my last remark. This is the last double page of the Psychological Atlas. Little did Paolozzi know when he appropriated the Munich catalogue of the Haus der Kunst in 1949 that roughly 30 years later, in 1981, he would become a professor for sculpture at the very Munich Academy, where he taught for 10 years till 1990. Eduardo Paolozzi was the first international call-up of high degree after the Academy had more or less stagnated during 3 parochial post-war decades, not willing to confront its more than embarrassing role throughout the Nazi regime, nor ready to re-establish its formerly international traditions. 30 years after he had skimmed and documented the post-war messages of the American dream in Paris, Paolozzi's appointment at the Munich Academy in 1981 signaled the end of the post-war stagnation of the Munich Academy. And this is the place in Munich where you can still meet Paolozzi today, near the Alte Pinakothek, and think of him as one who was a crucial witness of his time, as only few artists, in fact, are.
Thank you Thank you so much, Walter, for this terrific lecture on Paolozzi, which will definitely raise a lot of questions, and please give us a sign if you want to ask. Please, Raiko.
Thank you very much for a very, very informative presentation. I loved it. In part because I heard about Paolozzi's collage works from my colleague Hiroko Ikegami, who is actually working now on a similar track like you, looking at the Japanese pop collages by artists who spent their childhood years under American occupation. So it kind of resonates with her work, and today I saw the full scope of the what he did in the biographical background, which was very interesting. So if you like, please add Japan in your collection of GI culture and how that might affect the artistic production. That's my comment. Thank you.
There must have been many Paolozzis on the spots where the barracks have been. And of course, they reacted different, depending on the experiences they made, which were completely different in Paris than in Japan, than in the Philippines, than in Canada. It would be worthwhile to find all these Paolozzis who worked at this time.
Thank you very much for the relation, of course. I didn't know, and thank you for this information, that the first encounter of Paolozzi with modern art was through the catalogue of the well-known in Italy exhibition of the fascist movement in 1932. And this information, I think it's very important because it gives a special, it seems to me that that catalogue, the show was a real environmental collage of situation, photo collage, reliefs, statues, and so on. It was not simply futuristic, but something in between futuristic avant-garde and monumental fascist propaganda. So that point, I think, gives us the opportunity to read the special atmosphere of Paolozzi collages. So in my opinion, your relation was so interesting because not for what Paolozzi anticipate, but for what Paolozzi can mean for the history of pop art as a kind of response to post-war atmosphere. And I saw in the first Paolozzi collages statues and machine, Coca-Cola and monument. And I think it's a real in-depth reflection on a post-war trauma and a post-war atmosphere. So thank you. What do you think about it? Thank you very much.
Of course, the sources we refer to when we refer to the history of Paolozzi are mostly his interviews. As decided, as I have reported my view, it is necessary to differentiate in some points, and that is, for instance, the dates. All the a lot of collages, and obviously some of the scrapbooks have been dated later. But I think there's no doubt that the scrapbooks that I showed you are from the source material that he received in Paris. If he had made them in Paris or later does not really count. I think the time is clear. And the information that he saw this catalogue of the first exhibition of the fascist movement is, of course, an information he himself gave. And it shows the range of influences he digested. And the scrapbooks are some sort of digesting images. Greedy as he was for images, he had to deal with it. He couldn't throw them away, he couldn't keep them all, so you'd have to select. And this reference to the fascist summer camp is important because in the beginning it was easy to relate Paolozzi's collage to Kurt Schwitters, who was an enemy alien as well in London, and of course was exhibited there in the post-war time. And Paolozzi obviously saw one of these exhibitions. But he, later on, he often stressed that he did not like the aroma of provocation that was in Dadaistic collage. He was not interested, as he said himself, in provocation. And you see in most of the stuff that he has produced in these years, he in fact was fascinated. He had to deal with a fascination, to get rid of kind of fascination that was more or less obsessional. But if I imagine a 12-year-old boy in an Italian fascist summer camp running into this catalogue, which was of course modern, more modern than anything else in Europe, in form, in terms of form, reactionary in politic, but in terms of aesthetics, radically modern, has to be counted to the sources, though it's difficult to say which sources were decisive, more or less.
So, can I thank you for the precision and the care which you devoted to this study, exemplary study. I want to invite you to be a little less precise, in the sense that the idea of pop art having a father is to me a strange idea, because it's usually an invitation to a perpetual adolescence, in a sense. And what I think you sketched for us a way in which it suspends, it invites the suspension within the infantilizing imagery that's being projected by the real fathers who are the advertising industry and the communication industry and so on and so forth. So the fascinating thing is that, in effect, he doesn't claim the role of the father, or it feels unable to do so by showing the work and insisting that this is powerful and has a priority over work to come that he doesn't imagine will ever come in the way that it does. I'm actually wanting you to speculate on the part that you didn't. You gestured you can't do it, but the psychological atlas is an atlas not just of his interior and his struggles, But if it's an atlas, it's a larger atlas for, in a sense, the rest of the world. So could you expand, just in a few minutes, the thoughts about the more psychoanalytic approach you would take if you had time to do that, please?
I didn't catch it. The question is about not these paternal structures that I put on top, but the question is?
The question is, your psychoanalytic interpretation of Paolozzi, not just him as an individual, but him as an exemplary figure on a much larger scale. Yeah.
Normally, I shy off from making psychoanalytical interpretations of artworks because psychoanalysis essentially is a dialogue, and if the partner isn't there, you are the one who's projecting on somebody who can't answer. And it invites speculation that tells more about yourself than about the object you speak about. But what I was fascinated by in going this way through Paolozzi's work was the greed and the obsession with consumer goods that he could not consume because they weren't present, only in pictures, and to have this kind of symbolical food that he deals with. And the abundant way, it's not one car that he cites, it's dozens of cars, and it's dozens of vacuum cleaners, and it's dozens of of food that he cites. It gives the impression of a kind of fury that he must have felt in the post-war poverty he lived in, without an icebox in his studio, without the canned food that he saw the pictures of. It's not only obsession and greed, for me there's also some kind of fury about the difference between what they have and what they only show us and what we long for. And I think in 20th century you couldn't find a much more sharpened contrast in life standards at this very moment. And his chance was to deal with it in pictures. That was the way he could get rid of it, what he was suffering from. And that is going back to his childhood situation, not only as a son of a shop owner, but also as a child who copied illustrations as the first exercises he did, long before he thought he would become an artist. He grew up copying magazine illustrations, newspaper illustrations, and now he had them in plenty and could use them. It's fascinating to see that in some scrapbooks he's very precise in terms of form, and in others it's just very hasty, just like getting rid of the stuff by keeping it. That's what he essentially does.
I suppose I just wanted to reflect back something that you just said and take up the point about the Fascist Revolution exhibition, whether here we're seeing something about propaganda and desire in both fields, in that the Fascist Revolution exhibition is about creating a myth of plenty and success in marking a period of fascist domination in Italy. And what you've just sketched out about the desire that's promoted through this advertising is, in a way, another sort of propaganda that Paolozzi seems to be dealing with in some ways in the same way.
Yes, of course, it is propaganda. It's the propaganda of a market society, while Italian fascism was not really sure, I think, what it was propagating, and just exaggerated everything they could get hold of to heroize themselves. And of course, this is propaganda. You're right. I should have made the point more precise in this point. This is propaganda of industrial consumer society that's on the threshold of becoming the pop culture. Not pop art. It's necessary to differentiate that. And of course, it is convincing. We all fell prey to this pop culture and still do. It is convincing in a very. It's convincing in all these offers that it gives to us, because they fill not only our needs but our fantasies. And so this is political propaganda, and I think it is the second American invasion has to be discussed in terms of a cultural colonization of Europe, which is not. I'm not trying to propagate anti-Americanism, but I'm only trying to be precise. But it's the remark on the father of pop, of course, was Tim was more a quote than a language we should use. But I can imagine that when the Tate made the famous Hamilton exhibition in 1970 with a wonderful small catalog, Paolozzi must have noticed that he missed a chance. Whatever it was called, the father, the pioneer, or whatever, Hamilton took off the laurel. And of course, Hamilton was 6 years later in the field than Paolozzi was, and was very undecided himself. We always think that the collage for the This Is Tomorrow exhibition was a decision of Hamilton to become a pop artist. It wasn't. It was more or less by hazard that he did it, and only years later he saw the possibility of some kind of British pop art, which he made use of. And it's, of course, still, or Paolozzi again, telling that some of the most influential inspirations Hamilton worked on came from Paolozzi, and that is, for instance, the catalog Growth and Form, the book Growth and Form, which Paolozzi knew first. They planned to do an exhibition together, and Paolozzi lost interest, and Hamilton made it. And so I can imagine he must have been very furious and angry and sad going through a Hamilton exhibition at the Tate and seeing him taking the laurel, which in fact he deserved. But that's more sports than science, I agree.
Hello, sorry. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very, very interesting for me. But also within this trajectory of the fathers of pop and how maybe Paolozzi has been not rewarded as he should have, I think that something really important that within the independent group's trajectory, within Paolozzi's trajectory, which kind of, I think, goes against this idea of isolation, that maybe his collages actually weren't resented as maybe you suggested Banham did, is exhibitions like Britain Can Make It in 1947, or even more importantly, Black Eyes and Lemonade, organized by Barbara Jones, which, I mean, the point of which was to subvert aesthetic hierarchies and try to see whether it was possible to elevate images such as the ones that Paolozzi was collecting to the status of art. So I don't know, did you think about it? How do you think, I mean, I think that's very important in the trajectory of pop.
We had the conference last year in London about preparing an exhibition on pop global. And of course, this begins and will end with complete irritation of terminology. The history of pop is as successful as pop was. The art history, the written art history of pop is as successful as pop was. And this is the seduction that you fall prey to as an art historian. There should be a cure against the infection with pop. Like Andy Warhol, in his book Popism is one of the best books on pop art, I think, much more better than many of the books that we have written as art historians. And he uses pop as an illness that you can get, like pox. And you can't get rid of it. That's the thesis of Andy Warhol. Once you see pop and you label something, you can't return to beyond the threshold you were before. And so I still think that the written art history of pop art is as cliched as pop art itself is. And only gradually you can get out of it. And one of the ways is, and that is the merit of John Paul Stonnett, who did his very precise reconstruction work on Hamilton's collage and on Paolozzi's collage in the Burlington magazine, that he goes back to the sources and he sees, I always thought this was a collage, but this is a scrapbook. And that makes a difference. And I think this is the only chance to get beyond the narrative that is already established and that you cannot fight. A book like Hal Foster's Pop Age has the winning title it should not have, because it declares an epoch where there isn't an epoch, where we should not speak about an epoch. But I think the reconstruction, reconstruction of this art history, the way that I choose is the way that John Paul Stonnett chooses, is to go back to what was the material and not fall prey to the illustrations we have in the art histories books. And of course, and this is again the question of mother and father. Of course, the role of the women of the artists has always been neglected in case of Peter Blake and Ian Hayworth, as far as the cover for Sgt. Pepper is concerned, in relation to the first wife of Richard Hamilton, which obviously had a much greater influence of their common work than fits into the pattern of the art market. And so there are a lot of building sites still left for the youngs to write their thesis about.
Yes, thank you. It was just coming back to this issue of Hamilton and Paolozzi, accepting the fact that we set aside the idea of a father of pop, but I'm a bit confused about the role of intentionality in what you're saying, because surely there is a difference between Paolozzi making a scrapbook for some, whatever it is, private...
The role of what? The role of?
Intentionality.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
That if these scrapbooks are simply private objects, which in a way then are no different from, I don't know, schoolboy scrapbooks from the 20s or 30s, as opposed to Richard Hamilton self-consciously, knowingly making an ironic collage to be a work of art, surely there is no competition then for what is, if we're looking for a moment of precedence, there isn't a competition between those two things.
No, you're right. It's just, you're right and wrong, because it is a traditional theme of art history who was first. And we know sometimes the second one is more interesting than the first one, so it's not a merit to be the first. But it's a theme you have to deal with, I think, because it is expected that this is dealt with. And there is competition in it because it's an existence for the market. The modern artist who feels free is working for a market who has more rigid structures than any court society ever had. And which is not dealt with because it conflicts with the myth of the freedom of the artist. I don't envy any living artist for earning his money on this market. And so even if competition is not a theme, it's always a fact. And it splits the groups, like the ICA, like the independent group. It's interesting to see how few groups of artists worked for a long time in modern art that was founded on the myth of avant-garde as a military unit. And so I think art history has to deal with it. It should not be the main topic, but you can't neglect it.
So, yeah, but my point really was that I'm not saying we should neglect it, but that Hamilton self-consciously made his work as a work of art, distinguishes it from Paolozzi, who's making the scrapbooks as private things. That he's not imagining them to be public works. Is that not an important factor?
Was Hamilton conscious when he made Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Appealing? He made a design for a poster. That was what he was planning to do. And that it became like an incunable of pop art, I think he could not know at the moment. The specificity of these scrapbooks is that it's very difficult to say what they served for and what they meant to him. And so it's speculation about intention to solve this question. I think this is the legitimation.
Okay, I have to intervene. Time is running. Walter, thank you so much. And thank you to all the contributors to this fascinating discussion.